When Jesus had crossed again over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him. While he was by the lake, one of the synagogue rulers, named Jairus, came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher any more?" Ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat.
In the Shakespeare play Hamlet, there's a famous line that probably many of you have heard, and it goes like this: "To be or not to be, that is the question." And probably in our culture today, we could ask the same thing, but change it a little bit, and it is to open or not to open. That is the question. And if you ask us at fellowship here, are we open or not? Well, we're never really closed. We're just doing things a little bit different. But when we're talking about open publicly, when to do that, you could probably get as many varied opinions on that one as to the number of people that you asked. And so I just wanted to share our heart a little bit on this. It's not just a one-size-fits-all thing. So as you hear of different churches doing different things, each church has their own DNA. And one of the things that makes it challenging for us is we're a very young church for the most part. We have a lot of young families, kids, things. And that's one of our biggest questions is, when can the kids come in? And I mean, if I'm a young parent with young kids and I'm bringing them to church and I'm having to have them sit quiet, I'd probably just prefer to stay at home, watch it on video, and let them be in a familiar environment. So we're kind of taking the sound mind approach here, and that is just follow the state guidelines, and then just follow the promptings of the Spirit of when we feel is ready. But we've put out there that June 14th date, which we're hoping to shoot for, but we'll evaluate as we keep going. But thank you anyway for joining us on these online services, and thanks for all the feedback that you've given us. It's really helped us to be encouraged to continue on and do what we're doing. So But let's jump back into our passage this morning, and we're going to Mark chapter 5. And I think life circumstances really push us to really understand different passages in different ways and to really have favorite passages. In other words, if you're a person who really deals with fear, and it's easy for you to be fearful, then passages that talk about fear not, and all those times in the scriptures are probably ones that you gravitate to. Or if you're more anxious prone, and anxiety is a big thing in your life, then the passages on anxiety probably are. Well, Mark 5 is a well-worn passage in Susan in my Bible, and it's because it talks about a woman who has been dealing with chronic pain. And if you know our story and Susan's story, she has suffered from chronic pain for a long time. And so when we go to this passage, it was a few years ago when the Lord really brought this passage to me, and I've been praying through this for her ever since. And in this morning's passage with this, we're really dealing with two healings. There's a healing, not a dealing, but a healing of a little girl who is 12 years old, who gets brought back to life, and there's a woman who has suffered for 12 years, and she gets her healing. And the common denominator for both of them is their faith. And so here's where I want to go this morning as we break this down to help us get some clarity on this. And this is it. The first is just patient faith, that faith takes patience. And we're going to learn this from Jairus the father in this scenario. Then there's the enduring and tenacious faith of the woman. And I couldn't really pick either one of those, so I put them both in there. It's enduring and it's tenacious. And then finally, Jesus says two words that really bring this faith to be personal. And I think that makes all the difference. So let's just start with patient faith. I mean, Jesus is definitely racking up some frequent boat miles as he continues to crisscross across the Sea of Galilee. He was on one side, and he was talking about seeds thrown on the ground. They crossed the lake, ran into a storm, major lessons learned there. And then they got to the other side, and the minute they got to the other side, we talked about this last week, where the man possessed by a demon comes running towards him, and all kinds of lessons learned there. Jesus eventually leaves there, and now he's going across, and he's back on the other side, and a man comes up to him while he's there when he sees Jesus, and his name is Jairus. And the thing about Jairus is he's a synagogue leader. So some things we know about him is he's well respected, he's wealthy, and he has a soft heart for God. Not all Jews at the time were against Jesus, and so he had a soft heart. And what is really amazing is what happens next. Because this synagogue leader sees Jesus, runs up to him, falls to his knees, and is pleading with Jesus. Now that's not something you see every day. You don't normally see a synagogue leader on his knees pleading to Jesus, but here he is, and he's desperate. And the reason we know he's so desperate in the text is because his daughter, his 12-year-old daughter, is dying. And he just says, Jesus, if you just come and you touch her, she'll be healed. Will you come? And the great news is that Jesus says yes. And you can just imagine the father heart of this guy, Jairus, who just is like, yes, it's going to be okay. Jesus is coming and everything's going to be good. But we know that when Jesus starts walking with them, there were crowds that followed Jesus everywhere. And these were the kind of crowds that just wanted to be part of the show and see what was going on. And they're pushing in on him, and they're crowding him. And the disciples are kind of like security guards trying to keep people away and keep Jesus on task. And we'll get to this in our second point. But the woman who touches Jesus then feels it, and he stops. And he takes some time to then find out who touched him. And the passage really makes it seem like the disciples were really kind of irritated and like, man, all these things, stay on task. There's something really important going on. There's a young girl that's dying, and you need to get to her and get to her as soon as possible. And if you think they were frustrated, how much do you think the father, Jairus, was frustrated and confused and probably a little bit irritated? I mean, I know I would be. Jesus, you said you were going to come and you were going to help my daughter, and now you're stopping and you're just trying to find someone who touched you? And then Jairus gets the word from people that came from his home. In this delay, he gets the word, and here's the word: your daughter is dead. The last words you'd want to hear as a father, why bother the teacher anymore? And Jairus must have been numb. I mean, he went from the ultimate in hope that God is coming, he's coming with me, and he's going to help, and he's going to save my daughter, from the ultimate hope of that to the bottom of despair that she's already passed. And he had to be thinking, much like Mary and Martha did with Lazarus, Lord, if you would have come earlier, if you wouldn't have gotten distracted, you could have saved her. And why did you delay? And I know that this woman, you already healed her, so couldn't you just come and save my daughter and then go back and find, it wouldn't be hard for you to find out who she was and then confirm her healing? And why did you have to do this? And Jesus said just 5 words. Don't be afraid. Just believe. Don't be afraid. Just believe. And behind those 5 words is a truth that I think is profound, and that is, for Jesus, from his side, keeping a girl from dying and raising a girl from the dead takes no more effort for him. It isn't like Jesus has to go, oh boy, this is going to be tougher. I don't know how I'm going to do this now. I mean, it's going to be a lot more power that's going to be required to raise her from the dead. No, raising someone from the dead, keeping her from dying, either way, it's the same power for him. And on the human level, though, that is not as easy for us. And so what's happening here is that Jared's faith is really moving here from believing Jesus for something that is difficult, like my daughter's dying, and that's hard enough, to believing Jesus for the impossible. And now he's going to have to raise her from the dead. And yet there's something very practical in this delay. As Jesus delays, and it's not just a whim, he knows what he's doing, obviously. And he's producing something in Jairus, and he's delaying here, and that is this: God's blessing and grace never operate on our time schedule. His blessing and grace never is on our time. It never comes when we want it to be. In fact, sometimes his timing, I think, kind of confounds us, and his timing is never ours. And you've heard it said, the kind of cliche, God is never late, God is never early, he's always on time. It just happens to be never our time. And if we're honest with ourselves, when we ask God for something, we really want it yesterday, or at least within the week. Jesus, I can be patient, and I can be patient for a week, and it'll at least last a week. Now, God's not a tyrant, and he's not holding back in any way. He's not going, oh, I'm going to see if you really have faith here. No, his response, or lack of it, flows from his father heart, his big father heart that just loves us. And Jairus saw it firsthand when Jesus just said to his little girl, get up. And she got up. And the only ones in the room were Peter, James, and John, Jairus, and his wife. And they were all astonished. They were all astonished. And I think something that we need to understand here is that patience is an integral part of faith. If you're going to grow in faith, patience is definitely part of the DNA of it. And if we insist on Jesus doing things on our timetable, then we are going to be severely disappointed and we're going to feel unloved. But if you go to Jesus, really, with anything, he will give you infinitely more than you can imagine in his time. You know, Jairus, he wanted a healing. And what did he get? He got a resurrection. And his faith had to be deepened. So I want you to take a moment, and I want you to just discuss amongst yourselves, if you're with your family or with some others, just these questions. Are you currently waiting on Jesus for something? And if so, what is it? And secondly, how does the truth of this passage Change your perspective as you wait. Well, that would be enough in the passage just to have that one healing, but there's two healings in this, and so it's what I would call a twofer. We're getting two here. And so in this time, the first one, when Jesus was delayed, and now what we're looking at is the faith of this woman that comes to him, and it's an enduring and it's a tenacious faith. And this woman had been bleeding for 12 years. And any one of you who knows what it's like to face a chronic illness and be sick for a long period of time, you know how it can eat on you spiritually, emotionally, physically, mentally. It's draining. And then you add for this woman the cultural element and the fact that Leviticus 15 just spells out a lot of cleanliness laws that are very detailed, both for men and for women, and particularly for women. If they are bleeding beyond their normal cycle and it goes longer, then they are declared unclean. And anything they lay on is unclean. Anything they sit on is unclean. And anybody they touch is unclean. And so for this woman who's been dealing with this for 12 years, you can just imagine she is just considered unclean for 12 years, and she's dealing with this shame, and she knows that anybody she touches is going to be unclean. And here's what we know about her. We know that it was 12 years. We know it says that she'd seen a bunch of doctors and nobody could help her. We know that she'd spent all the money she had, it tells us, and we know that she got worse rather than better. And so she's pretty desperate. And the Lord gave me these verses early on when Susan was dealing with her chronic pain. And as I went through this passage, I was just like, has had chronic pain for many years. This woman had 12. Susan could double that. It's been 24 years of something that we've been having to deal with physically in this area. So double that, check that. Suffered under the hands of many doctors, it says. Now, this isn't getting down on doctors. This is just saying that they're limited. They practice medicine, and they don't know everything. And so sometimes there's confusing cases that are really hard. And I'll tell you, there's nothing that like when you're sitting in a doctor's office and they see the test results and they look at it and they say, you're a tough case. Basically, that's just code for we're really not sure what to do for you, which really just makes it even more hopeless. And and so that's a check. And then spent all that she had. We haven't spent all that we've had, obviously, but we've spent a lot of money, so check. And it's gotten worse rather than better, check. So we can definitely relate to this passage. And so with this woman, for 12 years, this woman has been dealing with this, and not only the physical pain, but this emotional shaming that has gone on that's been associated with it. And in most cases, when people came to Jesus for a healing, they would explain everything that was going on, and he would heal them, and it would be great. But how is she supposed to do that? I mean, there's the shame of what she's going through. She's unclean. There are mainly men around that are doing this. And so she's talking about something personal that would have to be broadcast before all the men, and the shame she feels for being unclean. And how's that going to happen? And she gets this idea. Well, she's desperate enough where she just thinks to herself, if I just sneak in and kind of weave my way in through the crowd and just touch his garment, then I will just kind of escape back out and no one will be the wiser. And I love Mark 5:29. And this is a passage I have prayed for Susan every day for years. She felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. I can just imagine as she touched Jesus' garment and as she's kind of weaving her way back out, that she feels this warmth in her, and it's like, it stopped. I've been healed. And no one really knows. My plan worked. But Jesus felt the power leave him. And Jesus says in Mark 5:31, who touched me? And everyone's like, who touched you? I mean, there are hundreds of people walking around you, and everybody's been crowding in, and all kinds of people have been touched. But when she have touched you, but when she heard Jesus say that, it was like it just came upon her, and she's like, I've been busted. Who touched me? And she must have felt, oh no, all my shame and everything is just going to be revealed before all these men. I'm going to be exposed. And then Jesus says this, then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet. And notice this, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. She's trembling in fear as she's kind of before all these people and telling Jesus the whole truth, and probably the shame she's felt for all these years, and how she's been unclean, and probably how she's unworthy to even be healed. And there's a couple things here. Because I think all of us struggle in this life with a certain sense of shame. Maybe it's just a besetting weakness that we continue to face. Maybe it's a humiliating failure that we've had. Maybe it's an embarrassing illness that we have, or a horrible event has happened in a past event, or maybe it's a struggle we've had, or a sin that just seems to keep coming up, and we have to keep dealing with it. And Satan can use this, and he can lie to us, and he can say, man, you're unworthy. How could a Christian even deal with that? And more than once, how could you deal with it again? A real Christian wouldn't really struggle with this, or specifically with that sin. You wouldn't deal with that one. But this woman had an enduring and a tenacious faith. And she said, I'm going to go to the only one who can really heal me. And when, it's interesting, when Jesus healed the little girl, he told him not to tell anybody. But when he healed this woman, her faith was broadcast before everybody. So what's the difference? I don't think here Jesus is saying, hey, I want to show your shame on display. I think what he's saying here is look, I want you to take note of her faith. Take note. This woman here, who you all feel is unworthy and is unclean, look at her faith. This is the faith you should have if you really know who I am and what I can do. And second, many of you, like my wife, suffer from a chronic illness of some sort. And you've prayed, and you've believed, and you've done everything you can, and you get nothing. And in fact, maybe it's getting worse rather than better, which seems to be our case. And I wish I could tell you why and what's going on, and I don't even know in our circumstances. I don't even understand it. I don't know. But I just hammer in over these years on the things that God has let me know. Here's what I do know. And these are bedrock, I think, to solid faith and to staying true to the one who loves us the most in the midst of anything that we go through. And the first one is this: not every promised grace is going to be received in this life. When you go to Hebrews 11 and you read about all the people that had all this faith and different things they got, at the very end towards it, it says, for the people who didn't receive what they got, and some died and some were tortured and different things, and it says, they were all commended for their faith. But here's the kicker: yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better. And you think, what could be better than my healing? What could be better than God rescuing me from this? I don't know, but Jesus says he guarantees it. Another thing I know is that God gives grace for each situation. My grace is sufficient for you, he tells Paul, when Paul said, I pleaded with him to take this away from me for so many years. And he says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. I don't think that when God has us go through something, he gives us a a grace to walk through it and a grace to endure it and a grace and mercy to understand him and know him even better. But I can even look, even what we've been through, I can look at other people's thinking and go, man, how do you go through that? Well, he hasn't asked me to, and so he hasn't given me the grace to do that. But if I was going to have to go through that and he wanted me to do that, then he would give me the grace to go through it. He'll give you the grace. And then the third point on this, I think, is that we can be confident in his desire to help. He wants to help. He desires to help, and he's doing something. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. And I love that. Notice it says, not that we might, not that it's possible, but he says that we will receive grace and mercy in our time of need. He will help. Which brings me to our last point, and I think it's on this one that it really, I think, emboldens why we can trust the Lord no matter what faith situations we're having to be in. And I think it really displays God's heart for us. And so that's why I've called it personal faith. And Jesus responds both to this woman and to the little girl in unique ways that are really intimate ways. Let's just start with the woman, and then we'll go to the girl real quick. First with the woman. Notice he says to her in Mark 5:34, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Notice he doesn't say woman, like it's been in the rest of the passage. The woman who was bleeding, the woman who went to many doctors, the woman. No, he says daughter. And this is affectionate, intimate, familial language. I mean, this is very intimate language. Daughter. Not just woman, but daughter. Your faith has made you well. And if you've had the fortune of having a really good dad in this life, then you know how much they love you, and they've loved on you. But I'll tell you this, their love for you does not even come close to comparing to the love of the Heavenly Father and what he has for you. And as earthly fathers, we're limited in what we can do for our kids. But our Heavenly Father, there is no limit. And by calling her daughter, Jesus is just really showing his heart. It's like saying, I love you as my daughter. Your faith has made you well. You don't need to shame yourself anymore. You've been healed. And it's interesting then when you go to the girl, the little girl, and what Jesus says to her, he takes her by the hand, it says in Mark 5:41. And he said to her, Talitha cum, which then in the parentheses it says, it kind of translates as for us, which means little girl, I say to you, get up. Now obviously the cum part here means get up, but it's the Talitha, and it does mean little girl or little woman. But it doesn't grasp the essence of what this word means because it goes even deeper than that. And Talitha, when he said that, that was like a pet name, if you will, an affectionate nickname. The best way I could describe it is, I know probably all of you do this even with your kids, and I know with our girls, obviously their proper names, Katie, Beth, and Sarah, but in our home, we'll call them different things. And so I'm usually referring to Katie as, hey, when Katie calls, I'll go, hey, Katie Roo. Or Beth, when she calls, I'll say, Bethy. We just call her Bethy. We've done that since she was a little girl, and it's an endearing close term. And with Sarah, it's Sarah Bear. And so it's as if Jesus here, when he says Talitha, he's saying Bethy or my Sarah Bear or Katie Roo. It's an affectionate, familial, you are my daughter, and you are family to me, and I am raising you. Get up. And I think this is important for us to understand, and the reason this goes even deeper is because when we can't see God's hand, when we don't know what in the world he's doing, and it doesn't make sense, and maybe you've been there, and we're there, and we're doing that, and it doesn't make sense. But when you can't see his hand, what this is telling us is you can trust his heart. His heart is that I love you and I am with you and I am carrying you through this. And maybe it'll come in this life, but maybe it won't. But you will still be honored for your faith. And if it doesn't, I will give you the grace and the mercy to journey through it. And you will get to know me better in this way. And it's really, it's an abandoning, it's a letting go of our rights and what we think God owes us. And it's saying, Lord, you know best, and I trust your heart. Let me pray for us before I have Dane lead us in our last song. Father, I just want to thank you that you are so patient with us. Help us to be patient in our faith and to be able to wait on you. Help us to, when we're demanding our time, to let go of that and trust in your timing, because we want your will done your way and in your time. And when we have to endure in faith, even in the pain that we are in, may we find grace and may we find mercy as we continue to approach your throne of grace. Thank you for your Father heart for us, that you love us more than we can imagine. You displayed it on the cross for us. Your heart was on full display. We thank you for that. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, fellowship, you know what we do at the end of our service. We always say, go love first. So go love first. And may God use you in your faith to show others his glory. Now let's join Dane as he takes us and sing along with him as he leads us to our last song, Sovereign Over Us.